Hi again, everyone, from Cedar Rapids. I'm Bob Ask, and this is my story. My life in the context of history. The history that I lived and am living, studied, still studying, and I guess with this series, still teaching it. Tonight, for vignette number 7, in our total projected number of 20, is number 7, which I have entitled My 1950s. A teacher coach at 3 schools. In a setting of failed World War II diplomacy and a rising Cold War. My schools, 3 of them, and as my career got going, in the midst of trouble everywhere. Well, my little world was humming right along that decade as I look back. All was well for me. I had survived my first year as a teacher coach at Marengo, a tough chore when you're living by yourself in a little room and you go home at night and make 3 preparations for the next day. Kind of a tough first year, but I survived. Not easy. Then came those twin years that I talked about. After 1 year at Marengo, it came that second, those 3 years when we met and love took over. And the rest, going into the 50s, is history. The rest of the 50s, lovely wife and a growing family. So that first year was the year 48, 49, right after the wedding, and then it was on into the 50s. Notice one thing from our previous vignettes. That little boy back in the 1930s had chosen correctly. I was a teacher coach, and the future looked very promising. But for the big world around me and for Maryland, it was not so good. Why? Russia had become the real winner of the Second World War and started to show it right away. Now, as for the political presidential scene going into the 50s from the 40s, President Roosevelt's death shocked the world. It came 3 months into his 4th term on April 12, 1945. Notice he died not celebrating VE and VJ days, the end of World War II. They came shortly thereafter in May and September of that year. His successor, Harry S. Truman from Missouri, would finish out FDR's final term. He defeated Thomas Dewey of New York in 1948, and going into the 50s is Harry Truman in the White House. We need to remember first about the world setting going into the 50s, how the World War settlements proved to be a real key disappointment. The aftermath of World War II was not a good one. Two of our allies during the war had become now our enemies, and a so-called Cold War developed, which means near war as opposed to hot itself. The trouble began, notice then, before the war was even over, before VE and VJ. The trouble was already brewing at the meetings that they held. The concessions, the mistakes that FDR would make, and fellow Harry Truman toward the end, proved to be very, very disappointing and tragic. Yes, I repeat, we won in 2 theaters on the battlefield, but Russia won the war the way it turned out. 3 historic conferences tell the tale, all in 1945. At Yalta, a conference in the Crimea, a Russian peninsula, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Joe Stalin came together to discuss surrender terms, and they decided that it's going to be unconditional surrender. Already, having come from the East halfway through Europe, Stalin and Russia was well into Europe, and they didn't want to leave. So the concession was made: Joe, you can have some choice parts of Poland. And by the way, you can have Manchukuo over in the Far East in China. In other words, the door was open to even more concessions and what was called the Iron Curtain in the European theater. Well, Roosevelt wasn't feeling good. You could already see that the Depression and all those years in the 30s of fighting for the New Deal was wearing on him. And he was hoping that maybe what would happen next would alleviate some of the damage done. It came at San Francisco. Yalta was in February. At San Francisco, Roosevelt went when the UN Charter was proposed. And Roosevelt's thinking was, if Russia is in the new UN, United Nations, we can get along with them. In July, shortly thereafter, Harry Truman was at the conference replacing the death of FDR. Well, it was at Potsdam in Germany that this big conference divided Germany into 4 occupation zones. One for the U.S., one for Britain, one for France, and one for Russia. This occupation supposedly would be temporary to a united Berlin someday. Berlin, the capital, was put into the Russian zone. So guess what happened not too long into the Cold War? They decided not to let us from our zone into our part of Berlin. Berlin was divided. We got half of it, but we didn't have access to it. So we had to airlift by plane, sides, supplies from our part of the occupation zone into our part of Berlin. Trouble and the airlift. And then, because this open city of Berlin as it was supposed to be, wasn't turning out to their advantage. You can remember in history when Russia built the wall. Why? To keep their people out of our free Berlin, because the difference was already in stark contrast. Blockade, airlift, trouble in the 50s to come, all from this before the 50s began. That's the baggage the 50s had to carry as things started out. Well, the first clash, hot clash, in the Cold War came in Korea. It lasted from 1951 to 1953. Now, up to this time, Korea was a part of Japan. Having lost the war, now we could decide as the victors of the war, what are we going to do with Korea? Well, Russia, who was supposed to help us according to the agreements coming out of Potsdam, never really did help us, but they wanted part of Korea. So Korea was divided, Russia in the north, the United States representing the UN in the south, with the idea that there would be a unification. Well, Russia left, and we left. And then the North Korea, which is now imbued with communism, that day struck our friends in South Korea. So we have a North-South war. Well, that was Korea. Things were going pretty good for General MacArthur and the U.S. forces. We had moved up the peninsula all the way up to the Yalu River, the dividing line between Korea and Manchuria. But just about when victory was in sight, China entered the war, and it was a whole new ballgame. Down, down, down the peninsula we were pushed. And some say Harry Truman made a big, big mistake by replacing General MacArthur, who was there as such a strong commander. Well, we settled down to a stalemate along the 38th parallel, which later was to become the famous DMZ. And President Eisenhower, in his presidential campaign that year, in 52, said, "If you vote for me and I win, I will end the war in Korea." Well, he did the best he could. 1953, a truce, the DMZ, and still a problem today. After Korea, 1953, the Cold War eased up just a while until Vietnam, and we'll talk about them later, had gotten into a situation where we got directly involved. More on Vietnam later. So there's that problem now coming along. On the domestic side of America in the 1950s, the big news concern was the growing issue of civil rights. 1954, the famous Warren Court Supreme Court ruling, Brown versus Topeka, Kansas Board of Education. The proclamation: racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. It violates the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. It KO'd the antiquated 1896 court ruling, Plessy versus Ferguson, which had said separate but equal is okay. In other words, if the schools are equally endowed from a standpoint of facilities, it's okay. The Warren Court said, you tell a person you go to this school because of the color of your skin, and you go to this school makes it inherently unequal. And this opened the door for all public accommodations beyond the schoolroom. To conclude briefly, because of time constraints, let me just say this. When the 1950s started out, I took my bride to Marengo. Remember? We were in Marengo 4 wonderful years. Marilyn never hated to leave, never really wanted to. We were there until 1952. Then we came to Cedar Rapids, and I was at Cedar Rapids McKinley for 5 years in the mid-50s, 52 to 57. And then it was on to Cedar Rapids Jefferson, 57 to 81 for coaching and 91 for teaching. Wonderful, wonderful schools, Marengo, McKinley, and Jefferson. 3 of our 4 children were born during this decade. Marilyn and I would never forget Marengo, McKinley, and off to that new school on the west side, Cedar Rapids, Jefferson. Much more on all that. Hey, we'll get into some Jayhawk football before too long. Bye-bye.